Good morning, everyone. Can I maybe just get an indication that everyone can hear me? Maybe a thumbs up. Right, I see a hand. Perfect. All right, thank you. Welcome to our second web chat for 2023. Our speaker is Dani Otto, so I'll just give a bit of an introduction to Dani. Dani manages the South African operations at Digby Wells Environmental. He holds an MSc in Environmental Management with a BSc Honours in Limnology and Geomorphology and a BSc in Botany and Geography. He is a biogeomorphologist that specializes in ecology of wetlands and rehabilitation. He has been a registered professional natural scientist since 2002. Dani has 27 years of experience in the mining industry in environmental and specialist assessments, management plans, audits, rehabilitation, and research. He has rehabilitation and geomorphology working experience in 10 countries, including specialist environmental input into various rehabilitation-related projects. These vary from rehabilitation of the wetlands of the Kruger National Park to swamp forest in Central Africa to alpine systems in Lesotho. All right, I'll hand over to you, Dani, to start the presentation. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you, Anya. Good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of LASA, the Land Rehabilitation Society of Southern Africa. Anya, can I just do a sound check and see if everyone can hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you, Dani, and I see there's lots of thumbs ups. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And the presentation, can you see that?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the background, phytoremediation, also referred to as phytomining. We'll get to that just now. This is about rehabilitation because it's LASA, it's our emphasis, and the idea is to generally look at rehabilitation and pollution control. So you'll see a few of these themes come up as we go through the presentation, and we'll try and keep it quite informal, and we'll try and keep some time at the end that we can have a discussion around it, questions and so on. And from there, I'll go on to the introduction. So the general theory and background is that we use plants, the technology of using plants to remove the contaminants from the environment, be it water or soil. And then a strong thing that's come through lately in the last few years is the microbes that are associated with the plants, removing the metals or anything else that that's the contaminant in the area. You'll see the themes as we go along. So just the metals, quite a strong theme that started in the 80s. From there on, pesticides, explosives, which are mostly nitrates, and oils or hydrocarbons. And then the general concept of biological pollution control. We normally intervene physically, so we dig trenches, drill boreholes, have well fields, have structures in place to have pollution control or to cut off the source of pollution from the receptor. So the idea here is to do it biologically, to work with nature, not to fight nature. See what is the nature that we can use to control these contaminants. So with that, the plants actually act as a windbreak. The photo you see there are trees planted on tailings. And then, so the wind is broken, so it stops the aeolian action, the rain, the runoff, and the groundwater. So it actually prevents flow further from the surface going into the groundwater or limits it. And then just carries the contaminants away, prevents the contaminants from moving. So it actually picks this up, accumulates this, and removes it from the soil or water, and then prevents that from getting to the receptors, and specifically keeping it out of groundwater. So that's the general concept of it. And for some bedtime reading, the Citizen's Guide to Phytoremediation by the US EPA, United States Environmental Protection Agency. So just to show that it's not just us, it's not just me, not just a bunch of scientists trying to promote something. It's something that comes a long way, and it's a fairly independent organization that gives you a bit of a citizen's background and the support of the theme of using plants for biological pollution control. Just on that, you'll see the theme come up quite regularly, the actual conceptual model, pretty simple model of You have a source of pollution, you have a pathway to the receptors. If you can cut off any of these from the receptors, you prevent the harm. So that's the general risk-based land management approach. The same applies for water. It's just more difficult with water. And water is mostly the pathway. It's one of the most common pathways. So it could be dust, it could be water, could be food. So that's something else to keep in mind if we do use plants for pollution control and for accumulation of some of these contaminants, that this could be one of the sources as well. So it's something to keep in mind. When you plant something that's edible, it does create its own problems. So just some background. I had the privilege of working in the 80s and with an engineer, Brian Cook, who was a tailings engineer with Rand Mines at the time. Rand Mines was a South African-based mining house that was the largest mining house in the world at that stage. And Brian's father was also a tailings engineer, so a lot of information that gets carried across from one to the other. And the same idea is to keep that information flow and to continue with it. And that's one of the things here, is to just generally make the information available. You'll see some of the information, some of the information that I share, even from Wikipedia or something like that. But the general idea is to get the concept out there. You can choose for yourself and see from there. From there, COMRO, Chamber of Mines Research Organization, an old organization from the 90s, was taken over by the CSR after that as Mining Tech, and the Chamber of Mines Vegetation Unit. So there was a specific unit that did the vegetation, that did the rehabilitation, the planting of it. So a lot of interaction, a lot of work with them in those days. And then the Water Research Commission coming through, supporting a lot of the research, a lot of the work that we did. And Anglo American was quite big. They had the Woodlands project out on the west end of South Africa, of Johannesburg. And one of the people to mention in these is Professor Isabel Wyersby. She's been along. If you Google her, you'll see a lot of her work in this regard, and quite a broad range. So not just phyto remediation, not just trees or woodlands projects, but quite a broad range of interest linking back to the phyto remediation concept. And then UJ, Professor Harmser is retired now, but there are a few people who continue the work in that regard. In the old days, ISCOR, company that doesn't exist anymore, they planted millions of trees, literally millions. There are a few companies now that are continuing with the concept, Harmony amongst other, planting thousands of trees in this regard. So we'll again look at some examples there of what we did. So it started with in the 80s with the atom absorption spectrophotometer. At that stage, it was quite big. It was quite something. It was a room-filled piece of equipment, laboratory equipment that you would use to analyze to see what sort of concentrations of metals you had. And this involved sampling trees, taking pieces of material, leaf and stem from trees that were growing on tailings dams. I'll show you a bit more about those trees, and boiling that material, breaking it down through boiling it in acid, nitric acid combined with perchloric acid, and with some interesting reactions, including some explosions every now and then. So if my nose doesn't work and my lungs aren't the same anymore, it's probably because of months of boiling acid and breaking down material to a complete liquid in order to see what metals are in there that you can then read in the AAS, the atom absorption spectrophotometer. Much more, much easier nowadays with ICP-MS and a few other techniques, much smaller equipment. The equipment in the laboratory don't fill the whole room anymore. And it just makes it easier, cheaper, definitely cheaper and easier to get the results out, much more accurate. One of the things we had to do is get a sample of 10. So from every tree, you'd have to take 10 samples and analyze them per tree to make sure that your variation in readings, you got an average reading of 10 per tree in order to sort of compensate for the inaccuracies of the laboratory equipment. And then amongst the trees, also at least 12 to look at intraspecies variation. So each individual tree may accumulate more or less metals than the others, so just to compensate for that as well. So the examples to follow aren't of the explosions, the examples to follow are of phytoremediation of what we've done in the industry. But back to where we started, my studies at university and through the Chamber of Mines, through Water Research Commission, Anglo, and different companies involved. at that stage, there's a 1988 tailings dam, so that's the year that we could figure out that this tailings dam was created. It was 1888, sorry, not 1988. So this will be the trees grow, and in the material, I say AMD there. I first said mine affected water, but it really is acidic, as you can see from the pH there. pH of 1,8 going down to 1,8 is a logarithmic scale, so that really is a low pH, one of the lowest I've seen. That was the extreme, so the average was just over 2, but 1,8 is quite something. And keeping in mind that this is not a laboratory acid, it's not a generated pure acid, it's a combination of acidity, so it generally makes it quite, you know, worse than a commercial acid, I'd say. And then the sulfates, up to 50 grams a liter. It's super saturated, so you'd have crystals forming within water. And aluminium of 1,500 milligrams per liter. And aluminium generally is toxic to most plants. If there's one thing that would inhibit your plant growth out of the metals, it's probably aluminium. And aluminium on the other side, just for the general theme, is linked to Alzheimer's in people. Again, that theme of ingestion or food being a pathway is quite important. The trees we looked at were Eucalyptus camaldulensis, purely because these trees, so we picked this up from water monitoring. This water goes down to the Vaal, and the Vaal to the Orange River that goes becomes an international river and goes into the ocean. So at these concentrations, it's quite a load, even if it's a small stream coming in. So from there, going from the water, looking at the sediments and looking at the trees. So we find what grows in these conditions is these trees, which is quite a small miracle in itself. And then therefore we analyze these trees. So I'm not promoting Eucalyptus camaldulensis or blue gum specifically. I'm just saying if something can grow in these conditions, we use them. It's not an aggressive invader. It can be managed. It's obviously an invasive. It's from Australia. It's not a South African or an African plant. So we do need to keep an eye on them. But if they grow in conditions like these, they're unlikely to spread. And we do need to still manage it. So that is something to keep in mind if we do talk about the exotic species. We're all about indigenous species. I'm all for it. But if something works and if something wants to grow in an acid of 1.8, then we utilize it. So in terms of accumulation, we'll show you some graphs just now, or a graph. Cadmium, manganese, lead, and zinc is accumulated in this specific eucalyptus species, is what we found. And with these, each of these have their own issues. Like I said earlier, I just want to link it back to why we're so concerned about these metals. Why should we be? This is people's drinking water potentially, or goes onto crops and going in through the ingestion. Through ingestion could go back into the system, into people. And like manganese affects hypertension, affects blood pressure, and specifically the liver. Lead replaces calcium in the bone for 2.5 years. That's the 2.5 year. That's the half-life of it. Also accumulates in the brain, and zinc and so on. So some of these aren't bad, like zinc, but in higher concentrations, they are an issue. So important for us to keep that in mind, the toxicity to humans, not just the accumulation and getting it out of the system, but why are we removing it from the system, and therefore prioritizing it. So in those years, 30 years ago, some primitive graphs, but the concentrations there that you can see in the trees, in the material of the leaves and the stems, quite high in terms of cadmium compared to what's in the water. The manganese for both what's in the water and in the sediment, quite high accumulation factors within the plant material, and then lead specifically from the water into the leaves, and zinc also for both of them. So at that stage, the discussion about bioavailability of metals, so the speciation of the different metals, iron 3 versus iron 2, and lead and so on. So the bioavailability is really important, and the pH of 1.8, most of these metals are available and soluble, and then taken up. But just important to keep that in mind in terms of what can, often you get a neutral condition, and then the plants can still take up these metals and remove them from the environment. So that's pretty important. Those are the tailings dams from 1888 with the trees on them, still in the Johannesburg area. That's a recent photograph. That's a 2023 Google image, Google Earth image, and you can see the movement of the material down a stream. In the bottom end of the photograph, you'll see the stream from right to left going down to the Vaal River. And yeah, people, I've cut out the residents around us, but very close to the edge of this Google Earth image, people live there. It's a residential area, and it has been for many years. But these tailings dams are still in place, and the trees are still on them. And I think they're playing a very important role in terms of keeping it together. Firstly, physically holding the material together, preventing the erosion and reducing what's going downstream. But then from there, taking up the water, these trees take up to 700 liters, average South African conditions, average tree, 700 liters per day of water that's evapotranspirated. So that's one way of getting the metals out, but you're also picking up this acidic water and reducing the flow. We prefer flow over no flow, but you know, if you've got a pH of 1.8 and sulfates of 50,000 milligrams per liter, greater than that, you know, you preferably don't want that in your system, even if it's a small flow, very high load. So the trees are still there, the trees are surviving, and in my opinion, they should be increased in numbers, and we can plant some grass around them. There are other eucalyptus trees like Eucalyptus heteroxylon that tolerate, or other plants tolerate them better. Where you can get grass like Cynodon couch grass that you can plant around on the tailings, directly into tailings, around these trees, so you get a proper cover to prevent the erosion. So we want a sustainable cover with you know, a cover that prevents erosion and uses ecological succession. And as you can see there from the 80s, not much has happened in terms of ecological succession, unfortunately. So that's something else that we want to promote and continue. The bigger concept of hyperaccumulation and phytoremediation, so the principle, as I said earlier, is that we want plants that accumulate and hyperaccumulate metals and contaminants. So whatever takes up more than they need and actually accumulated within them, we can then cut them and put them on top of tailings dams. They're held in that organic material for some decades. So it slows down the mobility, it slows down that recycling of the metals and keeping them out of the system. Just for the bigger picture in terms of phytoremediation, there's phytoextraction or the phytomining that you may read about quite often. So arsenic, cadmium, and nickel. I don't think I need to talk about arsenic and its toxicity, but very important. A lot of our arsenopyrites, a lot of our gold in the eastern side of the country is associated with arsenic, and also in West Africa. So that's it's a direct toxin to humans and very important. On the volatilization, mercury, also highly toxic, accumulates in the brain, is also turns into a vapor quite easily. So that's again also associated with mining and informal mining, and really important toxin to keep in mind. Selenium, less toxic, but in high concentrations an issue. Selenium is included in some of the daily minerals and vitamin tablets that we take. So not that bad, but mercury is certainly not something I want in my system. The phytodegradation, the phenols, often we'll see about chlorinated biphenols being an issue in the old transformer oils, which was quite a broad problem in South Africa at some stage. So that degradation with the plants helping with that is really important. Stabilization on the zinc, copper, aluminium side. We spoke about aluminium earlier, linked to Alzheimer's. And aluminium becomes mobile and bioavailable at high pH and low pH, unfortunately. So that stabilization with the plants there really helps, and it's something, as I said, some of the plants, toxic to most plants, but some of the plants can accumulate them. And it's often a primitive lack of development. It's often a situation that the plants don't want to accumulate. It's not like plants evolved to accumulate these metals. It's more the opposite, that they did not have the mechanism to block the metals out is not there. So these accumulate by themselves in these concentrations. Either way, we'll take it. We'll use the plants in that regard. Cut them, have them regrow again, and put the wood in the tailings dam somewhere where the metals are removed from the system. The degradation through the root system, as you can see there, some examples of pyrite and so on. Also important, we'll talk just now about constructed wetlands, another form of phytoremediation as recognized by the US EPA and the UN and a few others. But the Johannesburg Zoo, for example, built some constructed wetlands, and specifically the root zone has an antiseptic effect. So it actually kills off bacteria and kills off pathogens. So that's used in that root zone as I almost want to say a new frontier of phytoremediation that we use. The phytofiltration, uranium, lead, and chrome. So chrome-6, if you ever saw the movie Erin Brockovich, otherwise Google it. Chrome-6 is a big thing internationally. Many sites, not just linked to gold mining. Don't want to pick just on the mining guys, but different industries. And really important, lead and uranium, lead being a product of uranium, but again, an important thing for where we sit in Johannesburg. If you look at a radiation map of the CBD of Johannesburg and the general Johannesburg area, quite important, and uranium associated with the gold, and many uranium plants in the area historically in Johannesburg. So that filtration, that ability to absorb the radionuclides, the radioactive metals or the radioactive elements, is really important. And I'm going to show a list just now of plants that accumulate radionuclides specifically for that reason. And we'll talk a bit about Chernobyl. It was just sort of touched on as one sentence on Chernobyl, but it's important to know. So just overall with hyperaccumulation, again, back to the theme of getting the idea out there, getting the concept out there, not forcing it on anyone, just for yourself to decide. But if you look it up, there's a specific program where we looked at a phyto guide, and not we, as the academics, looked at a phyto guide, looked at 800 literature sources and two databases at the time, with records of 4,000 plus data entries, and for South Africa, 1,410 species that accumulate specific elements out of 582 genera. So we want that. That's what we want, is that spread of different species that we can grow in different conditions. 257 indigenous or naturalized to Southern Africa, or South Africa, exactly what we want, and some of the 56 endemic to the Cape, and specifically the Western Cape. So that biome and that area being very important, and mostly non-invasive and least concern in terms of conservation status. So again, there's the author reference there to look that up, but this is quite a benchmark just to get an idea of what do we have in South Africa. So it's that the opposite of phytomining is that biomining, of seeing what have we got and what can our species do for us, what can our plants do for us. So that's just a benchmark, and to give you an idea, it's quite a spread, and I almost want to say a new frontier, something nice to look into, something new to explore into and see what species we've got. Yeah, you won't see the detail, but that's just a list. If you go to Wikipedia and you type in hyperaccumulation of radionuclides, it brings up a list, and that list has the links, the active links within them. And on each of these links, if you click them, they have proper references. So I'm not saying that Wikipedia is a good scientific reference. Please don't use it as a scientific reference, but within it, there are good references, and you can look those up and make sure that they're reviewed in scientific references within. But it's just interesting to see there's a page-long list of accumulating species specifically for radionuclides, and that's what we want in life. That's what we want to do, is know what can take up these things. You know, Chernobyl and a few other places, and I said it happens in different places. Our granites are fairly radioactive; they've got radionuclides in them, so it's a natural thing as well. But we want to know what collects this, what we can use to accumulate the radionuclides, and then to get rid of them, to use it in that way. On to some examples. Again, South Africa. I'm going to focus a bit on the South African area, and then we can go more international from there. This is Berkheya cordiae. It's a form of lily, as you can see there. Sorry, not lily. Astris here. It's daisy. And this comes from my hometown, Barberton. It grows on a specific type of geology there, very unique geology. It's called a cyanite, not cyanide, but cyanite. And brought from there to the Rustenburg area, where it was planted around smelter, so where nickel was quite a problem in the ground. So as you can see there, if you help this species along up to 22 tons per hectare, we can get a biomass out of that around 2 meters tall, and the accumulation of nickel in there quite significant, also cobalt. But in this case, the main thing was nickel, to remove the nickel from the soil. So one would plant the material almost on a commercial scale in the contaminated soil area, and then really chase this along with amelioration, with fertilizer. You want to get the material to grow as fast and as optimal as possible, and then harvest that. While it grows, it accumulates the metals, and then one can then cut this down, and they actually cut the material down and then put it through a smelter again. And there you can actually see nickel ingots that came from these plants. So that's quite something. You normally get concentrations that are measurable, and you might put the material on a tailings dam or something. But here we've actually removed the nickel, that you can physically see it in ingots. So that's specific to the Northwest area, and a specific example that I almost want to say made South Africa a bit famous in this regard. Across to the BBC, there's a tree that they specifically have. There's a species there that accumulates nickel to the point where it looks like if you cut it, it looks like it's bleeding metal. You can see that the nickel within it. So very high concentrations of nickel. And the good thing about this, so the Berkshire we spoke about earlier, the smaller plants, the smaller, faster growing plants, if you can get 2 or 3 crops at 22 tons per hectare per year, then you can really remove some metals. That helps. Trees, less intensive in terms of labor and fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides and the rest of it. So trees you plant and leave, they live off the rain and carry on. And over time, so short term, your smaller plants are better and quicker. Long term, your trees do their work as they carry on over the years, and can accumulate tons of metal within the wood. And then you cut them and have to be careful where you go with that, but normally tailings dams or sites, and then think of how we can retain that metal concentration in the material that you've collected. But larger amounts over longer time in the trees, and then quick and fast on the smaller growing plants. Just methods of measurement. Here we've got the same image under the microscope, and you can see there cobalt, manganese, and nickel. So it's a form of measuring what's going on while the plant's alive. You can see what's accumulating and how. So it's about the mechanism, learning more about the mechanisms. As I said earlier, it's often a non-evolution of not blocking out the metals, and they get taken up into the system. That's what we capitalize on and use them as hyperaccumulators. Some further examples: the Indian mustard is specifically quite a popular plant, and you'll often see it suggested for phytoremediation, and you'll see a lot of publications around it. So lead reduced by 28%, selenium reduced by 48%, and also effective with zinc, mercury, copper, and cadmium, and removed the radioactive nuclide cesium-137 at Chernobyl. So it's one of the plants that they used out of Chernobyl was this Indian mustard. And important to know. Ferns, we spoke about arsenic earlier. So ferns in general, certain ferns accumulate arsenic. And then just our old acacia, Pichelia and Korea on our tailings dams, and then Cumbretum erythrophyllum, one of our bush willows. So you'll see some publications by specifically Prof. Wyersby and her team on these species. We also analyzed for these 3 species. We're also planting these 3 species in areas at the moment as we speak. And I'll just show some quick photographs about that a bit later. Other examples, Salix, our willow trees, that's where Disprin comes from. Some of these deal specifically with cadmium, nickel, and lead quite well. As we said earlier, lead quite a nasty, directly taken up into the system, specifically younger people and kids. And we want to keep the lead out of the bone structure, replacing that calcium, and out of the brain. And also they can deal with quite a mix of heavy metals and with diesel pollutions and hydrocarbon pollution. So that's quite important. One of the biggest artificial wetlands as we go into Phragmites australis, which is a reed. one of the biggest artificial wetlands or constructed wetlands passive treatment systems in the world is for hydrocarbons. It's in Oman, and it's for hydrocarbons and dealing with oils. So that's traditionally not something you think of as planting plants in something that's oil contaminated, and that's changing. So we're getting these specific species that can deal with it and can help handle this. Phragmites australis are a common reed in South Africa. You see it in most wetlands, most river systems. It's known for its petroleum polluted soils that it can handle, and they grow fast. So that's the little photograph on the left that you can see there with the lady standing there. These are specifically very fast growing plants, and that's what we need, is that uptake and that growth. And you can use the material for something else as long as it's not ingested, or use it as a compost on a tailings dam, or upping the organics or the biological side of things. And just an indication there of the root system of accumulation of mercury in that specific example. Again, a really fast-growing, really hardy species that you can transplant easily, plant easily, and it just carries on and spreads by itself and does the job. So these are the things we want. It is more aquatic, but we can use it on the transitional zone as well. The other, there's some Agapantha species and Electroplesis, the photograph on the right that I've shown there. Also indigenous and also specific to accumulating specific metals and stand out as some of the more better known hyperaccumulators for South Africa. That's us at the moment as we speak, busy planting trees and tailings, the old acacias, the old careers, and then bush willows, the combretums. Chosen specifically more around surviving in this harsh environment than anything else, but this is a community project from there that is mechanized, but that's just to get quite a deep hole in a specific area in tailings, and from there the community project is to fill that hole with compost and soil, plant the trees, and look after them, water them, and get the trees growing, protecting them against frost in the winter with taking grass, thatching grass, and tying that up around the bark to get them through those first 2 or 3 years of frost and exposure and fire and everything else that works against you when you're trying to plant trees. But trees by the thousands, accumulating, acting as windbreaks, and getting that biological succession, the ecological succession up as we want. This is quite a well-known tailings dam that's being reclaimed along the, I think it's the N17. As you come into OR Tambo from the south to land, you normally fly over this. It's a landmark, but you'll see around the edges, you will see around the edges of the triangle, you'll see trees. And those trees were planted there by Brian Cook and Rand Mines many decades ago. Still doing their job. This is the Eucalyptus sideroxylum that I spoke about. So sideroxylon doesn't give off too many oils and volatiles that kill the grass and everything else around it. Camaldulensis is a bit competitive in that regard, and sideroxylon less so you can actually plant them with grass, and that's quite a nice example. This is another tailings dam on dolomites, and the trees that you see around the edges of it, we planted in the late 90s, mid 90s, late 90s, about 10,000 trees, not just these, in other places as well. Cut off that near surface seepage, the vadose zone. As I said earlier, 700 liters a day per tree, average South African conditions, average tree size. A few thousand of those is quite a bit of water that you're putting into the air. It's a water use in itself, so it's not ideal in that regard, but you've got to manage it and compare it to where the water is going into the dolomites and into the vol. And then just see what, manage to weigh up the two against each other. And that accumulation of metals that goes with that is quite useful. Constructed wetlands, as we said earlier, so you'll see in that guide with the US EPA, it's a big thing. I have a 65-slide presentation on constructed wetlands that we're not going to fit in here, so I'm just going to touch on it in one slide. The bottom line is slowing down flow of water through a specific substrate to give the plants and the bacteria the opportunity to do their work. So nitrate removal through bacteria, phosphate removal, and sulfate reduction. So where normal plants have phytoremediation, the bacteria do photosynthesis. The normal the bacteria in here, specific bacteria, to chemosynthesis. So they break down sulfuric acid, for example. They use that as their food source, as their energy source, break down sulfuric acid into carbons, into carbonate, which is very fortunate. So you have carbon capture here, you have carbon generation. So from an acid that's generally linked to acid mine drainage, reduce that through to carbonates, and the sulfide that remains links up with most of your metals. So your metals and your sulfides are affiliated, and that settles out fairly quickly, except for manganese. But generally a win-win situation where you're basically recreating or biomimicking a wetland, constructing that, making sure that water flows at the right retention time, anaerobic conditions to anoxic conditions. Make sure that the bacteria have a carbon source that they use, like hay or sawdust or charcoal, and then they less so charcoal, sawdust or wood chips. Manure is also used. Any carbon source, they use that to break down the acid and to generate carbon. So we've actually calculated, and this wetland was built for a specific company, and we've calculated the carbon capture in this that you can do chemically and work it out. And that links back to your targets on ESG that we'll touch on just now. So it's just that bigger picture of actually getting that biodiversity up. There's a lot of functionality happening in these wetland systems from a biodiversity point of view, but also from a flood retention, nutrient removal, and so on. And with that, then the carbon capture. Manganese, I mentioned earlier, doesn't settle out with sulfides as readily as the other metals, and we generally use the redox potential. We generally use a oxidation cascade at the end of the system, and give it a lot of surface area in the form of rock for the manganese to then precipitate onto the rock with the change in conditions from anoxic or anaerobic through to aerating it with that oxidation cascade. So some of these it's not just pure biology or pure chemistry, it's a bit of physical work as well, in terms of getting flow and to stabilize flow, and then to get metals to precipitate. But so that's more chemical, less phytoremediation. But the plants themselves, as I mentioned earlier, they have an antiseptic effect around this root zone. They take up metals, they take up salts, the typha that you see there, typha capensis, takes up chlorides, takes up sodium, and those are the more difficult elements to accumulate, and the more difficult elements to take out in systems, in biological systems. But it works with these plants there, and those plants are almost 3 meters tall. It's a bit difficult to see a scale here. It's in West Africa, and these plants grow. They don't have much of a winter in that side of the world. Even their winters are very, very moderate to warm. So these plants grow like crazy. You cut them back, you can use them or put them on a tailings dam, and then have them grow again. So just touching on that. So as I said earlier, the bigger picture, the bigger strategy, this strategy we worked out for one of the companies, you don't need to see the detail in there. It's just to give you that idea of a program of different things put together in a poster format that the client said to us, I want to go to the minister and explain to him what we're doing, but the man on the street needs to understand as well. So that's trying to summarize what you're doing. So from an ESG point of view, you've got certain commitments in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon capture, and neutrality in terms of your impacts, offsetting, and the rest of it. So this all links in with that. If you're reducing your pollution loads, you're cleaning up the environment with trees, with planting indigenous trees. With that comes carbon capture. You're increasing biodiversity. You're offsetting for something that has an impact somewhere else. It's just a win-win-win situation, and that's the thought. With this, the community involvement. So it's not just the mine or the industry or whoever's involved. That might be a rehabilitation company or a government department, like working for wetlands or working for water. It becomes a community project that follows on the post-land use of whatever your activities were, and your green economy in land use is what you're after. So you start looking at not just agriculture, but rehabilitation on the one side, but alternative energy, local upliftment, local employment, climate mitigation, carbon capture, biodiversity offsetting, the whole cascade of as I said earlier, the win-win situation. And I think that's really what we're after. That's what we're trying to achieve here. I have gone through this a bit quicker than I thought, but we can maybe use the opportunity for a discussion. So we'll have at least 20 minutes or so that we can use for discussion. Anya, if you want to maybe just facilitate. Just want to get out of the presentation so I can see what's happening.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure, Donnie. I see there's a few questions in the chat. Teresa, I don't know if you're also unable to mute people that want to speak. Donnie, I don't know. Can you see the questions?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay, I'll
Thanks. Let me go into the questions there. Will it help to plant sterile blue gum trees? Yes, it will. It might push up the costs, but it definitely will help. And that's then one less worry, is that these trees might start moving along and they might increase or start coppicing or something like that. So definitely can use them. It's just a cost consideration, but if you're going to compare it to the cost of having to cut them out later, having to bring in working for wetlands, working for water to remove these, or the community, definitely is a good idea. Yes. I see there's some hands up. Clément, you can carry on.
I think everyone should now be able to unmute. There we go.
Okay.
Donnie, Rihanna Beatty from GeoVicon Environmental in Middelburg. I just want to find out, or the opinion of the different people. We are on the Highveld. We've got a lot of coal mines. A lot of our groundwater specialist predicts where the acid mine drainage will occur in future. Now, some of the mining companies want to start planting trees in these areas where there's only predictions. Is there no concern that we don't know at the moment what is the impact of planting all these trees in a grassland biome?
Yes, agree with you. So it's definitely something we have to keep in mind. Grasslands are under threat as it is, and something that we need to look after. There is, however, so it's again like earlier we were saying, like we don't really want exotic trees. We might not even want trees in a specific biome like in grassland, but it's weighing it up. If we're going to have a few hectares or quite a few hectares of dead area where there's acid flowing out, you know, then it might be worth putting the trees in there, but let's not go overboard. So I think that's the moderation in trying to model how much is going to come out, over which sort of front is it going to come out, what sort of size. And we talk about the aspect ratio when we talk about wetlands. So maybe a wetland system, what we had designed in some of the areas was a bit of a reverse osmosis system, followed by a wetland system, including grasses, including hydrophytic grasses, and then from there trees, if need be, some indigenous ones. And almost, I think the best case is if you have trees that need a lot of water, so that if they don't get the water, they die off. They won't continue. So we don't want an aggressive tree definitely don't want wattle there. We don't want an aggressive tree that will continue and spread. We want something that is functional. And while the water's there, the trees will be there. And then if the water sort of dries up with time, then the grasses can come back. So a good thought, you know, a good question, but just some thoughts in that regard of saying, like, let's see if we can plant trees that'll die if the water disappears or if the water gets too little. We don't have this spread of trees taking over grassland areas, specifically in you know, if you've got rocky outcrops and the rest. So there's within the grassland areas, you've got specifically more sensitive areas, and we got to just keep that in mind, the seep zones and so on. I'm just going to answer one or two questions on the comments on the side, and then we'll go back to the people with their hands up. We'll be with you in a minute. Which trees or shrubs are found compared to blue gums? I think compared to blue gums, some of the better indigenous trees would be the Combretum, the phylums, the river bush willows. High water uptake, Unfortunately, they drop their leaves. They're not deciduous. They drop their leaves in the winter. So then you get a bit of a standstill in comparison to the gum trees. But I'd say one of those, and then Risp pendulina, Sericea pendulina is also frost resistant. It's evergreen and also quite a high evapotranspiration rate. Sorry, can I go back to someone who's got their hands up again? Then we'll answer some of the questions on the side again. Quite see who it says view all. There's 85 people in the one hand. So if you've got your hand up, please go for it and we'll.
Oh, all right. Thanks. Thanks, Oti. Oti, one of our challenges we are facing on our tailing storage facility, especially for platinum group metals, is the Tamarisk ramusissima, which is overgrown on our tailing storage facilities. So what would you recommend we can plant on our tailings, since we know the tamarisk is one of our alien invasive species. It can spread to our nearest farmers and it can affect the communities in some ways. But now we want to plant some indigenous trees, especially in our tailing storage facility. Which tree species can you recommend, especially in platinum group metals tailing storage facilities?
Thanks, Reginald. Yeah, so it's one of the issues. The tamarisk loves some of the tailings dam in the Free State area, Sasolburg area, not just the tailings, the platinum tailings as well. Again, it's sort of weighing it up against the one against the other if it's functional, but you don't want them spreading. As you said there, I'd say the species we mentioned earlier, Vachellia, the old Acacia carew, Vachellia carew, Sericea pendulina, because it's evergreen, Sericea lancea, so the careers, and then the river bushwallow, Combretum rheophilum. Those are the ones that tend to tolerate the metals, tolerate the conditions on the tailings dams. And we've learned this from looking at what's on the tailings dams, but then subsequently planting them, and they seem to be surviving. So those are the ones not necessarily hyperaccumulating much, but at least surviving and staying there and indigenous, and they tend to spread. And even with the Vachellias, the acacias, putting nitrogen back into the soil, so your legumes, preferably get legumes in if you can, and put nitrogen back in the soil, specifically in those tailings conditions to help with that. I just want to answer one on the comments on the side. What is recommended for planting in contaminated stormwater dams at landfills? Adrian, I'd say Phragmites that we discussed just now, Phragmites australis, and then the typha. The engineers will fight with us. The engineers need their dams and they need their canals open, so you just got to talk to them about it. But between the two of them, Phragmites and typha, and specifically Phragmites, because it's more of a woody species and it takes up more, accumulates more, grows fast, and it's got structure to it. If there aren't any other hands, I'm going to go to the next one. Advise on disposal, treatment, end use of the dead excessive vegetation. We generally try and go to back to a tailings dam, the best designed tailings dam that we can get it in the center and get rid of the material as far as possible away from the receptors. If we need to, then landfill sites. That's the bottom line. And one of the things we suggest, depends on what's being accumulated. If there aren't any radionuclides and it's not, the metals being accumulated aren't too bad, the wood could probably be used for furniture. I wouldn't use it for fire, and definitely wouldn't use it for anything that will be ingested or come into contact with people. But if you don't have radionuclides and the metals aren't too drastic, you can probably use it for furniture and a few other things. And then as it progressively gets worse, depending on what's inside the wood or the material, onto landfill sites, onto tailings dams. The same goes for the Phragmites and the typha, the material, the grasses for thatching. If you've got metals like cadmium in your thatching grass, I don't think it's an issue. The grass and the material from reeds, you can still use for to make baskets and mats and the rest of it, if it's not radioactive or really bad metals in that regard. I just want to see if there's any other, what the other questions are here. Do you have to harvest the plants after a certain period? Leaf litter results in heavy metals being absorbed in the soil again. Yeah, so one actually wants that active growth. The faster and better the growth is, the better the accumulation is. We worked on 5 years with Eucalyptus camaldulensis. It's something we worked out. It'll be optimal. It depends on different conditions, but I'd say around 5 years would be the thing. And yes, if you do have deciduous trees and they drop the leaves, it's a recycling mechanism and it slows things down. Okay, I think the stormwater dams we've answered in terms of landfills, Phragmites and typha, I would say. Rare metals mining is a big thing. As I said, the whole phytomining thing, if you look that up, Yuri, you'll see it's on the phytomining side. It's a really big thing. I wanted to present some of the results here where they actually show you the different metals and the different accumulators and almost an economic case of how you can mine and how you can take up metals and specifically rare metals with plants. Happening fast, big theme, and it is going, it's happening, and specifically for the metals, the battery metals and the smart metals that they're after nowadays. It's a big thing. Lack of water, what happens to the metals? Yeah, so the trees die, the metals literally sit in the wood. It's not easy because they're fibrous. It's not easy to get the material out unless you burn it. Within the ash, then the metals will stay behind. But generally, within that wood, it remains. And if you put that wood on a tailings dam for a few decades, it'll be in the wood, and then preferably on a tailings dam or a landfill site. That's one way of removing the metals. Savannah Boom. Trees for hydrocarbon contamination. The only one that I've read there is Salix, but as you say, that's more for wetlands. I'd have to look up on the hydrocarbon trees. I know that the grasses that they use for the hydrocarbon in certain species, but I don't, Pamela, I'd have to get back to you on that one in terms of trees for hydrocarbons in an area. We do have, yes, we do have bursaries. HR department will handle that one. But I don't know if it's specific to phytoremediation, but we do have a bursary program, and different organizations have different, bursary programs. On here is LASA, and we do also support students and getting them to conferences and different talks, and we can maybe put you in touch with the different organizations in the industry that have bursaries. There's bioavailability of metals in a high pH environment, depending on the type of metals or type of trees. Yes, so at a high pH environment, it's generally aluminium. There could be others. The type of trees, generally not. It's there are quite a few trees that accumulate different metals. So it's just the question of how much. So that's why we talk about hyperaccumulators. So some trees accumulate more aluminium than others. Camaldulensis, Eucalyptus camaldulensis for one is quite a high accumulation of it. Recommended in a high pH environment, not typical problem in the runoff. Yes, could still be used, and I focused a lot of trees holding things in place. We can use different grasses and different plants specific to the trees. We can, in a high pH environment, still use trees and a combination of it. I prefer a combination. I think the better, as I said earlier, is if we have in the wet areas, we have Phragmites and typha. We might have a grass area and some different herbs that take up, or daisies, like you saw earlier with Burkia, different plants that take up metals, and then the trees. So the better the combination, you just get much more value for your rand if you combine these as opposed to these monocultures. The planting of trees appear to be more cosmetic, where there's no harvesting and management associated with it. Yes, unfortunately, a lot of tree planting, and the other sad part of it is that, there are literally companies that will go out and plant 1 million trees, which is fantastic. But we've got to just focus it and say, okay, where do we want the trees, why, and what species where. So don't make it a PR process. Make it an ecological process. Talk to your rehab experts. Talk to your just your experts in general, your botanists and so on where to put these trees. Talk to the communities around you, what trees to put where, and make sure that you spend your money there, that these trees are still there 5 years later or 10 years later. So I think that's quite important. Cyperus, yes, lots of cyperus species, lots of floating wetlands. On the cyperus species, you'll see them in Hartbeespoort Dam at the moment. So some cyperus species, a lot of work being done on that at the moment. Are you aware of any work done to bring the regulators along? Water affairs, water and sanitation in some regions not supportive of phytoremediation. Yes, I think it's dependent. There's some at the conferences like Piet-Louis Grinling and different people who are involved with from the department side, different department sides. When we spoke about constructed wetlands, we had a course at University of Pretoria a while ago, and Piet-Louis was there, and he was quite. You had lots of questions, let's put it that way. We come a long way, and we're not here. I'm not here to promote something specific. I'm saying, like, here's a concept. It might work for you. It can work in places. So there's nothing in it for me that if somebody plants trees, that's great. It's not a money-making thing. It's not a big thing. It costs money, and you got to have the input, the buy-in from the different departments. And as I said, working for water. And the government department spend a lot of money on removing eucalyptus trees from waterways every year with the community, and here I am talking about planting eucalyptus trees. So it's a very careful thing. You've got to manage them and got to have them in specific areas and make sure that they're managed. And then I think on the phytoremediation side, the Department of Water and Sanitation is much more open to constructed wetlands, where a few years ago it may not have been the case. I can't talk for the department, but just my interaction with them, and we've been working with people there for many years, and we've known each other for a long time. And it is specific to specific regions. So we've got to be careful what we say where, and so I don't want to talk for the regulators, but certainly we have found each other in some areas, and we have disagreed in other areas, and we have to be careful. They remain the regulators, and we have to stick to the law of the land, and make sure we get exemption where we need to get exemption, and permission where we need to get permission. I do think there's some good work we can do with the indigenous species and continue with that. I don't think there's any harm in constructed wetlands. Not to oversell anything is the important thing, and making sure that we've got the permits in place or the exemptions in place. The next question on the permitting requirements. Anya, please tell me if there's a hand up. I'm going along with these comments on the side and the questions. Permit requirement, regulatory process. Yes, if you go over a certain amount of hectareage of certain trees, then you need permits. Or exemption, but specifically forestry permits of certain species, and there's exemption in other cases. So you don't want to plant something that's a category 1B alien invasive that you're not allowed to have, and the law clearly states that you have to destroy it. As we spoke earlier about tamarisk. So tamarisk volunteers and takes over on certain tailings facilities and waste facilities, not just tailings. And you then actually have to spend a lot of time, containing these and destroying. The geochemical behavior of tailings prompt the mobilization of metals. Sometimes you do get reactions over time. So when you first put down tailings material, it might be alkaline with a high pH, and then over time you start getting oxidation and reactions, specifically in if there's pyrite there, if there's a bacteria, Thiobacillus ferrooxidans, that breaks down the metals with the chemosynthesis that I said earlier. So it becomes a biogeochemical reaction, and acid is generated, and then from there, because of the drop in pH, you will get mobilization of metals. So metals do change from, say, iron 3 to iron 2, become more mobile and become available on the bioavailable, as we say. Also, if higher biomass indicate reduced ecotoxicity of substrate. Biomass. It could be, but you could have plants that are growing. So it's difficult to say if you have a high biomass that you'll have reduced ecotoxicity. You could have the mustard we saw earlier that grows around Chernobyl. So it loves it, it likes it, the same as the tamarisk on waste sites and on tailing sites. They grow there, they tolerate metals, or they like some of the metals. Doesn't mean that there's less toxicity there because there's a higher biomass. But if over time you can take everything up, then that'll help. That will reduce. So then the biomass increases, and the toxins actually sit captured in the plants and not in the material. So I think in that regard, there'll be that's about the best indication of biomass versus a toxicity. But it's not a good fail-safe guide. I think I've been through the questions on the side. If there are any questions that I've missed, or if there are any other further questions, please raise your hand or just alert me to those questions on the side. Otherwise, I think that should be a wrap. Wait, I see Emmanuel. Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, my mic was on mute. I didn't see that. Danny, thanks for the presentation. I just want to ask, you said the phragmites and the couch grass, we can compost them and use it as a compost in whatever we want to. But then isn't there a problem, like if we compost the materials from this, are we not also putting it back to the soil, those heavy metals that are in the compost, and well, that cycle will still continue? So what options do we have for, especially for grasses? For trees, there are a lot of other options, but for grasses, what options do we have?
Yeah, it is a problem. You've accumulated these metals now, so you cannot go and distribute it again. So that we generally cut and go to the middle of a tailings dam, middle of a landfill site. That's the best we can do. You can't now go out and spread it. Water Affairs used to have the saying, Department of Water and Sanitation used to have the saying, dilution is not the solution to pollution. So you've concentrated everything up, and now you go and distribute it and dilute it in that way, but you're still putting it back into the environment. So even though it's contained within the compost for some time, I'd say tailings dam or landfill sites, unfortunately, that's your limitation. So you've got to know where you're going to go with your material. If you're going to start accumulating it into trees or into grasses, and specifically, as you say, they're grasses, landfill site or tailings dam would be my suggestion. I don't think, unless you analyze it, it's the same as manure and the same as compost from sewage treatment works. You can analyze it and see what the concentrations are, and the concentrations available and guidelines available. If they are below those concentrations, then you can use them elsewhere. And again, I'd use them carefully. But short answer is middle of tailings dams, middle of landfill sites is probably the best we can do.
Thanks.
Sorry, Donnie, I see we've reached our time. There's one last question in the chat, and if possible, Donnie, will you just add your contact details maybe in the chat also, if anyone else has any further questions?
I'll do that. Any more questions? Hands up. I see there's one more
in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, I see. Dangerously radioactive. Would the mustard plants still be dangerously radioactive if you remove them from the Chernobyl area? I think so, yes. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but yes, I don't think the activity of the radionuclide stops because it's been taken up by a plant. So yes, the material would then, I would still treat it as active. So again, back to a waste site for radionuclides, but it does the radioactivity by taking it up into a plant. Thank you. I think I don't think there are any more questions, and I don't see any more hands unless I'm missing anything. But thank you everyone for your time. So sorry, yes, some hands I see now.
Donnie, Rihanna Byte again from GeoVicon Environmental. I just want to find out about vetiver grass. I mean, a couple of years back, vetiver grass was the answer to everything.
Yes, interesting debate. I'm neutral on it. I'm trying to be an independent scientist here, and yes, the species grows, and I say species, subspecies, cultivars, different species. It's a registered trademark, or you can get it as a registered trademark, and they have impressive root systems. They grow in areas where other species don't grow. I don't want to promote it, but I don't want to talk against vetiver. I'm literally neutral. I've seen it in many tailings dams, literally in this last year, in different areas on tailings dams, on different, on different sites, and they tend to survive where other plants don't. So nothing against the species. In terms of phytoremediation, I haven't seen anything of it accumulating, but I'd have to look that up to answer you in terms of accumulation side of things. But generally, if something grows where most other plants struggle, let's not fight it. It is the registered trademark of vetiver grass is sterile, as far as I understand. So it will not spread biologically. So that doesn't have an advantage where you have something that survives, has a good strong root system, and carries on. So I think that in that regard, it speaks for itself. The other side, we have to look at both sides of the coin, but I have nothing against it. I hope I answered your question there, but I say I'm neutral towards it, but it grows in areas where I haven't seen much else grow.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we don't actually know if it really takes up that amount or that high number of metals.
I'd have to look that up for you.
Okay, thank you.
Are there more hands? See, okay, I was going to say I see hands up, but I can't see who it is.
Emmanuel, I think, is that a legacy hand? I see your hand is still up, and then we have Helen. There we go. Helen has a hand up.
Please go ahead, Helen.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Donnie. I'd like to ask you, please, about using phytoremediation and constructed wetlands around sewage facilities, our treatment works, and because, as you probably know, it's quite a big problem all around. I'm here in KZN on the south coast, and so what we have is we have issues at various points. The one is that some of the effluent from the treatment works is, it's all returned directly into the rivers, and I'm wondering whether it would work to recommend possibly constructed wetlands or even just in situ planting in those areas to help to sort of improve the quality of the effluent going back into the river. And also I'm wondering whether it would be possible to work with either of those solutions or both directly around sewage pumps, because we end up with a lot of leaks from the pumps when there are problems elsewhere, blockages and so on in the whole system. So I'm wondering whether you think those are viable suggestions to make, and if possible, whether you could recommend any indigenous plants that would be optimal in those areas. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Helen, and thank you. Yes, the Kruger Park sand parks use them. I've got a presentation of like 70 different South African constructed wetlands used, but specifically for wastewater treatment or for sewage treatment, the Kruger Park uses them. There are some results that I've got for Crocodile Bridge, for Skukuza, for the different plants, the different structures. You can see them on Google Earth. So in my presentation, I've got the photographs of the constructed wetland, and then we've got the results, water in, water out results for years. So very exciting topic. I think we should have another topic just on constructed wetlands again. But yes, a very definite yes for constructed wetlands, for wastewater treatment, for sewage treatment is a big yes. And I use specifically the parks, but if they use it, I think it says a lot. And then internationally, it's probably one of the biggest uses of constructed wetlands is for sewage treatment, and specifically for polishing afterwards. So you keep the plant. In some of these cases, it's the primary treatment system for smaller camps in the Kruger, for example. But yeah, so they are effective. The plants, Phragmites firstly, and then Typha. So a combination of, generally the one will push out the other. It'll probably be the Phragmites pushing out the Typha, and then just your substrate, your gravel bed with this Phragmites in is quite important. But I'm a Phragmites fan. I love Typha, nothing against Typha, but Phragmites just gives you the growth and the root system that not many other plants keep up with. So that would be the answer. And yeah, you can, I think if you Google the results, or I can also share with you the results of the Kruger Park constructed wetlands for sewage treatment. It's exciting stuff, and it's been many years. It's not, you know, it's been decades of them using the system and improving the system over time. And I think it's what we need in life. Is there's a lot of systems out there, catchments out there that can benefit from systems like these. It's low technology and easy, and something that the communities can put in place themselves as well, and municipalities.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Please could I ask you to share the presentation with us in the comments or whatever, if that's easy.
Cool. I think that's everyone. Unless please shout if we're missing anybody, but thank you very much for everybody's time. And please look up phytoremediation, phytomining, constructed wetlands. As I said, it's a question of getting the information out there. There's no secrets. It's just trying to share something that might work and be good for the community and the environment.
Thank you, Donnie, and thanks everyone for attending. Just a note from our side, Larja is planning a few more web chats for this year. If anyone is interested in sharing knowledge, you can contact Teresa or me. I did add our contact details in the chat. Thank you so much and enjoy your day.
Good. Bye.
Thanks, bye.